The Prince Regent George was likable, fashionable, had good tastes and a keen eye for aesthetic. He was a patron of the arts and a trendsetter, but he was also frivolous, lazy, and gluttonous. He drew much ire from many of the key players of British politics, including Parliament as a whole, and the Duke of Wellington. Yet, upon the death of his father in 1820, he ascended as King George IV, and began a reign marked primarily by personal problems, especially a very troubled marriage. Parliament had for a long time tried to restrain his spending, as the king's personal finances had become tied to the civil list, which was state money granted to the monarch, and King George was thought to be highly wasteful. And though he was never particularly engaged in politics, he did make some notable firsts. While his father had tried to go from being a German king to a British one, he would come to truly show himself as a king for all the Isles, making trips to Ireland and Scotland, something which an English king had not done in quite some time, showing that at this point, Britain really was becoming Britain, and not just Big England. Though he had shown sympathy to Catholics while as Prince Regent, once he assumed the position of head of the Church of England, he found that he could no longer do so, as it would be a dereliction of his duty in the church. He was a trendsetter and a patron of the arts, and his impact on fashion lasted. He would sometimes be referred to as the first gentleman of England, as his obsession with fashionability was seen to be akin to what much of the nobility was becoming. It's notable to point out that at this time, the British nobility had really lost a lot of its sense of honor, duty, and nobility. There was a marked cultural shift which certainly didn't impact all of the British aristocracy, but could be notably felt, as their role, duty, and importance was stripped away, leaving them just with dwindling wealth. Yet, George's life of excess would cut it short. He would die on June 26th of 1830, from internal bleeding, resulting from a ruptured blood vessel. His only legitimate child, Charlotte, had died of complications after a stillbirth, causing the throne to pass to his brother. And at 64 years old, William IV becomes King of Great Britain. He had a short reign of only 7 years, though he was noted for being highly diligent, a substantial change from his indulgent brother. These short years were, however, marked by massive social changes. The Reform Crisis of 1832 expanded voting, giving voting rights to more men of the middle class. As this class was ascending while the nobility declined, poor laws were changed, expanding the welfare state of Great Britain, and new child labor restrictions were put in place. King William, also King of Hanover, gave his German kingdom a new liberal constitution. These years can be marked by a rapid expansion of liberal ideas. Yet, as an old man with no surviving legitimate children, succession was a pressing topic. His throne was ultimately to pass to the daughter of his younger brother, Princess Alexandria Victoria of Kent. Yet, in Hanover, succession was male-only primogeniture. Thus, Hanover's throne would go to his younger brother, Ernst Augustus, thus ending the personal union of Great Britain and Hanover. Alexandria Victoria was born in May of 1819, the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathern, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. She described her childhood as melancholic, growing up with a domineering and strict mother. During her teenage years, her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium, which, yep, Belgium's a place now, I guess, wanted her to marry Prince Albert, son of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and planned for the two to be introduced. Yet her uncle, King William, wanted her to marry Prince Alexander of the Netherlands, the son of the Prince of Orange, because the Oranges never go away. However, she did ultimately meet Prince Albert, and they liked each other immediately. Later in his life, King William tried very hard to not die before Victoria turned 18, as he wanted to avoid a regency, not trusting her mother who would be regent. And indeed, only a month after Victoria turns 18, King William dies, making her Queen of Great Britain. Early in her reign, the British state is controlled by the Whig Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, with whom she gets along quite closely, and frequently turns to for advice. Yet by 1939, the Whig Parliament was losing confidence. Its majorities had become quite narrow, and after a failure of Whig legislation designed to change the laws of Jamaica, removing power from the plantation owners, Lord Melbourne resigns, and thus the Queen instructs the Tory minister, Robert Peel, to form a new government. Peel, however, expected that cultural tradition would be followed upon the changing of Parliament from Whig to Tory hands, and that the Queen would dismiss some of her ladies-in-waiting, senior female attendants of the royal household, many of whom were the wives of Whig politicians. Victoria, however, refused, leading to substantial scandal, leading Peel to conclude that he could not form a government, as he could not guarantee the confidence of the crown. This is a really interesting moment, as the already weakening power of the monarch is shown to still play a vital political role. The importance of the monarch being surrounded by the right political players on the surface is meant to illustrate the confidence of the crown, but in reality reveals how important it is to ministers to influence the crown, that in order to form a government, the queen must be surrounded by people who have the right party alignment. Just what does this say about the relationship between Parliament and the Crown at this time? It certainly indicates a very political power game. This crisis and the inability for Peel to form a government ultimately causes Lord Melbourne to come back. While Victoria was a young queen, she was also an unmarried woman, and thus lived with her mother in the palace, something which she resented. This likely played a role in her decision to take more seriously the idea of marrying Albert sooner rather than later, though she always liked and was attracted to him, expecting to one day marry him. Thus, in February of 1839, Victoria marries Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This period of her reign becomes politically complex. The Whigs lose power once again in the 1841 general election, leading to Peel becoming the Prime Minister of a Tory government. Around this time too, the Irish potato blight hits, to which Victoria gives £2,000 in support. In 1846, there is another political battle surrounding the repeal of the Corn Laws, a set of tariffs and trade restrictions on agricultural goods. The Tories oppose the repeal of the laws, while the Whigs and some liberal Tories, called the Peelites, support their repeal. Victoria sides with the Whigs. This is an example of a fascinating economic dynamic that is emerging at the time. The liberal Whigs and financial and business class are pushing heavily for a free trade system, while the landowners and Tories support restrictions. This is a really crucial dynamic that will pop up throughout the rest of history since, where certain trade restrictions benefit those tied to the land and tied to the nation, while those who can move capital internationally or serve as intermediaries benefit from unfettered trade, often with philosophical liberal ideas as the pretense, yet at its core is ultimately a fight of economic interests. Though a repeal of the Corn Laws only passed narrowly, it is indicative of this time being a clear shift in the power struggle between the old nobility and the new rising financial middle class. Victoria, for her part, had been quite influenced by the Whig Lord Melbourne, and after her marriage she became quite influenced by Prince Albert as well, who grew up in one of the most liberal duchies of the German Confederation. Yet beyond just their personal influences, there was a clear recognition that if the monarchy wanted to survive, it would have to align itself with this rising middle class. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert very clearly knew that the dominant class was this new middle class of merchants, industrialists, and financiers. Old Europe had been bound by nobles, princes, kings, and bishops. They were bound together by the land, by the church, and by families. They were the peoples of kingdoms, duchies, and bishoprics. Their identity was in the entity itself, and it needed no explanation, no justification. Yet, in the 19th century, as all these old institutions began to fade away, and the old rulers were supplanted by international financiers and ministers, when God, tradition, the church, legends, fables, and parables gave way to a growing liberal atheism, Europe became very unstable. The 1940s began to see a rapid increase in radicalism. Working class radicals, wealthy student radicals, academic radicals, liberals, nationalists, atheists, anti-monarchists, and labor groups. This soup of instability all began to boil up to 1848, where towns, counties, duchies, and kingdoms began to mean very little. The new identity of the nation-state began to take its place. Romantic nationalism would become a key driving force of revolutions in 1948. The new industrialized economies began to alienate much of the lower classes, and working class radicals began to revolt. Wealthy students and academics with liberal atheist philosophy began to lead revolts. There has never been such a period of widespread revolt and revolution as there has been in the year of 1848. Ireland, France, the German Confederation, the Empire of the Habsburgs, Moldavia, Wallachia, Denmark, Schleswig, Galicia, Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire either experienced revolution or were involved with one. Back in Britain, the risk of these anti-monarchist revolts prompted Victoria to leave London for the Isle of Wight. A rising nationalist movement in Ireland had begun to become quite prominent, A renewed desire for Irish independence, fueled by Celtic romanticism, had led to the beginning of violent clashes, a state of affairs which would continue into its peak in the 1922 Irish Civil War. Back in England, working class movements began to pop up, demanding changes to laws, additional voting rights, and better social conditions for their class. It was in this year as well that the Communist Manifesto would be published. These movements were initially supported by the wealthy financial class, and indeed many of the student radicals were the children of this class. Yet a pattern that would be observed repeatedly is that, just as in France decades ago, once the lower classes begin to become truly revolutionary, the wealthy middle class begins to become fearful. It backs out. The ideas it had perpetuated had initially served it, but once it saw the fervor of the lower classes, that began to frighten them. Back in Britain, the Whigs were largely the representatives of the wealthy middle class, of financiers and merchants, while the Tories represented nobility, the old Britain. Yet increasingly, radicals would also be present in the political environment, representing Irish nationalists, Chartists, and other working class movements, including, in the not-too-distant future, communists. Over the following decades, republicanism would grow in Britain. However, following the late 1940s, Victoria is out of immediate danger, and the situation begins to calm down. The 1850s increasingly begin to become a time of outward focus. The empire is enormous at this point. However, most of its expansion has been done by private business. Today we consider India of this era to have been under British control, but up until the 1850s, it was being governed by a private business, one that got its charter way back during the reign of Charles II, and Victoria became quite personally involved, believing that the expansion of the British Empire was a civilizing and liberalizing force. This era was marked by a belief that the empire, through expansion, would protect people from unscrupulous leaders who might exploit them, bring prosperity to the poor of the world, educate them in Protestant liberalism, and overall uplift and civilize them. There is a story of her becoming quite upset with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston for engaging in diplomacy without first consulting her. The British view of this era, and indeed that of Palmerston's and Victoria's, was focused around the interests of the empire and the balance of power on the continent, particularly with respect to the Russian Empire. This concern can be seen to really begin during the period of Pitt the Younger's prime ministership, and during the 1850s, Russia had become very large, very powerful, and was now engaged in war with the Ottomans. Britain and France joined the war on the side of the Ottomans in an effort to fight back the Russian Empire from Crimea, to make sure that it wouldn't be able to gain a dominant control over the Black Sea. This is particularly notable because Russian military power had always been land-based, and now Russia was gaining a naval advantage, something which the British, who relied entirely on their naval supremacy, could not abide. Around this time in 1858, Victoria's oldest daughter, Victoria, would marry Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia. This aligned with another one of their policy objectives, which was concern over the growing power of Prussia. They hoped that by marrying their daughter to the prince, that she would spread their liberal ideas, ultimately causing Prussia to liberalize. Another substantial imperial policy would change at this time as well. Until now, the East India Company had been its own government in India. However, this would ultimately change, and its assets and territory seized by the crown. In 1857, sepoy rebels had successfully been able to take over East India Territory and the territory of their appointed governors. Allied with Mughals, they declared Mughal ruler Bahadur Shah Zafar to be the emperor of Hindustan. The rebellion was brutal, as were the East India Company's forces, yet it ultimately only lasted 1.5 years, after which the East India Company was dissolved by the British Crown. Its assets and debts were assumed directly into the crown itself. It would continue with some limited operations until 1873, yet for all practical purposes, the company ceased to exist, and India became a crown territory, with Victoria, the Empress of India. Victoria, the shining beacon of British glory, would herself change. In 1867, in the Palace of Windsor, her beloved husband, Albert, would die of typhoid. She would live in mourning ever since, wearing dark clothes, being referred to as the Widow of Windsor. Internally, liberalism continued to expand. The 1867 Reform Act doubles the size of the electorate, changing the property restrictions associated with voting, allowing for leaseholders and tenants to be able to vote as well. The following year would see the prime ministership of Benjamin Disraeli, though not even for a full year, before he would be replaced by the liberal Gladstone. The conservative Disraeli and the liberal Gladstone would have quite a rivalry, switching terms as prime minister multiple times. By this point, the old Whig and Tory dynamic had been replaced by the liberal and conservative parties, with some similarities, but a slightly different dynamic. The conservative Disraeli believed in one-nation conservatism. He was a social reformer who passed public health acts and cleared slums, believing in a united Great Britain and a government that was actively involved in bettering the lives of its people. He also believed in the spreading of liberal principles and the British Empire, which he did so as a heavy and active interventionist. The liberal Gladstone, on the other hand, was a firm free trader and was much more averse to spending. He made a number of administrative reforms, often ones that came at the expense of the nobility, including the elimination of the purchase of military commissions. He was less interventionist, one policy that he was staunchly committed to for his entire political career, yet one which never manifested was his support for Irish Home Rule. The new dynamic of this era is one where the imperial class, that made up of the owners of the imperial companies, the financiers, and the ministers and governors of the empire, was firmly in control of the British state, and the old nobility was really irrelevant at this point. In the British Empire, at least, this class, this network of families, this political apparatus, and these companies had won and had total control of the empire. So the new dynamic was more around different ideologies and interventionalism, fiscal and trade policy, and there certainly did remain class and faction differences. The lower classes were increasingly becoming more of a political force at this point, yet it was clear which group was on top of the empire. It was at this point that Britain began to become heavily involved in the Middle East as well. The protection of the British trade route to India had been a long-standing point of vital importance, something which popped up as far back as the Napoleonic Wars. By the late 19th century, Britain began to fear the influence of France in the region. In 1875, Benjamin Disraeli made the decision to purchase shares of the Suez Canal. This was done to ensure the security of the trade route with India, and it was ultimately this purchase that led to the recognition of Victoria as Empress of India. The sheer importance of the Suez Canal in British trade would lead to Britain occupying Egypt directly in 1882. Even though the Ottoman Empire still nominally controlled this territory, a series of Egyptian nationalist uprisings had threatened the security of the canal. This being so vital to the British Empire, Britain went in to secure it, thus beginning the period of Britain being a highly active and involved player in the Middle East. Yet Britain mostly liked to avoid fighting. They would use physical infrastructure, trade deals, diplomatic and political leverage, bribery, and playing different groups off against each other to make sure that they had a control over that most vital stretch of trade route. Beginning as far back as 1839 and occurring periodically through the rest of the 19th century and even into the beginning of the 20th, Britain would fight multiple wars in Afghanistan in order to counter Russian influence in the area. It's very clear through this period that by any means necessary, Britain is going to make sure it has control over the trade routes. Ultimately, this is a very curious time. This is a time of rapid economic and imperial expansion. It's a time of immense political upheaval. It's a time of war, and yet it's a time remembered as the Pax Britannica. The time that Britain was so strong that there were no major continental wars. Well, except for the wars there were. It was a time of rapidly expanding liberalism. It was a time where many of the old lords lost everything, and the new aristocrats took their place, forming what was to be the true ruling class of the empire. And yet, while it was so liberal, it was also a time of rejection of the libertine and decadent 18th century, a time of social conservatism and prudence. Yet, it too would end. The Victorian era ended on January 22nd, 1901, as the 82-year-old Queen would die on the Isle of Wight, leaving her son to become King Edward VII. Edward's reign was short, lasting only 9 years, as he was already 59 when he became king. He was crowned in August of 1902. He had been an army officer as a young man, noted as intelligent, witty, and likable. He was also noted as a playboy. He always tried to be discreet, yet he wasn't entirely successful. The scandal of one of these encounters, occurring shortly before his father's death, would lead to his mother blaming the incident for the death of her husband. He was a major trendsetter in fashion, and a substantial patron of the arts and sciences. When he became king, it was notable just how much the whole kingdom liked him. And though his reign was short, the Edwardian era is particularly iconic. The look that he set, the big facial hair and tweed clothes. It was a time of great prosperity in the empire. It was a time that after the First World War, people would look back on with great fondness. Edward wasn't particularly politically active, although he did play an important role as a diplomat. He was also quite financially prudent, relying on the most significant financiers of his day, like Ernest Kessel and Nathan Rothschild, which people often objected to. His reign saw further liberalism and a major stripping away of the powers of the nobility, particularly during the 1909 People's Budget Crisis, which would ultimately result in the House of Lords losing their ability to veto. Maybe the round and jovial Edward is like Britain, and that those were the last days that Britain would feel that round and that jovial too. When people think of the old continental empires, they often think about large armies like the Spaniards. They envision battles of grand conquest. And while Britain certainly did engage in this, Britain's empire was quite curiously different, far more reliant on trade and finance, an empire which it continued far after it lost its territory. The British Empire shared much more in common with the Dutch. Perhaps the closest example of a conquering army is the British East India Company, which is a curiosity of its own, as this large private company was effectively given the right to form its own government. It originally entered India and engaged in commerce, though over time it would become more aggressive, fighting battles of conquest like the 1757 Battle of Plassey or the 1764 Battle of Boxer. Victory in these battles gave them the right to collect revenue from local lords, and enshrine them as effectively a continental overseer for much of the population. In areas that they didn't control, they often contracted their troops out to local rulers, who would pay them a fee for the troops and guarantee them monopolies of trade. By the 19th century, they had built such a vast and complex structure in India that they were making money as administrators, being effectively the apparatus that oversaw a good fraction of the continent. Yet, in 1857, after a major rebellion in India, the British Crown would take over the East India Company directly and become the direct ruler of India. The company's assets and its debts were held by the Crown. Although some small assets were sold off, the majority of it remained as a Crown possession, where the Crown would then begin setting up an administrative structure in India, ultimately leading to the Independence Act of 1947. Yet still today, it's quite notable how many of the banks and institutions of India are British. Perhaps their influence never fully left. Africa bears some similarities to how the empire expanded into India, although it isn't quite the same. The African colonies primarily developed out of trading posts and forts. These were developed by English and later British traders who wanted to maintain secure positions, early on for the gold and slave trades, but as time went on, these African trade positions would encompass palm oil, timber, ivory, rubber, cocoa. The 19th century in particular saw a large wave of diversification in Africa, after the government back in Britain banned the slave trade, and would go on a century-long campaign to make sure that everyone else would stop the slave trade as well. Many African colonies, however, originally weren't even particularly elaborate developments. Sometimes these were just vanity projects of some lord or a wealthy businessman. They would set up a position in Africa, begin doing business. Sometimes local tribes and kingdoms would go to interact with them and they might trade with each other, or might just live side by side without much interaction. Yet later on in the 19th century, the crown began to take some direct possessions in Africa. And at this point we start to see very large infrastructure projects in Africa. It's also when we see some of the more notable wars, like the Ashanti Wars and the Zulu Wars. Back in London, many financiers became enormously wealthy by financing these infrastructure developments, and also built substantial influence. and many of the most powerful institutions of the British Empire still exist today, and were the financiers of the infrastructure projects of the Empire and in Great Britain itself. It's also worth noting that many of these infrastructure projects were the first examples of convertible debt. So while these banks were the creditors of these infrastructure projects, that did mean that they had the possibility of becoming their equity holders, an enormously influential position to hold. Some of the most powerful companies that built the African colonies were the Royal African Company, the British South Africa Company, and the Royal Niger Company. One very powerful company, the United Africa Company, formed when, after losing a royal monopoly charter, the African and Eastern Trade Company and the Royal Niger Company merged. They would later merge with a company that had a very strong presence in the palm oil business, Lever Brothers, which are some of the companies that have since formed the basis of Unilever. Many of the most powerful mines today come out of British Imperial mines, like Rio Tinto, whose mines were once held by Matheson & Co., before it was acquired by the Rothschild family. Many prominent African institutions are British as well, with Standard Chartered and HSBC being notable examples, as well as the South African Absa Group, which until recently was owned to a large degree by Barclays. Africa is a perfect example of a place where Britain, for the most part, wasn't that present, but its institutions, infrastructure, and industry were set up as private British endeavors. And to today, the presence of the British Empire can certainly still be felt. The Middle East is quite interesting as well, as the British Empire didn't enter the Middle East for quite some time. It only became particularly active in the Middle East during the 19th century when it was trying to maintain its trade routes to India. Yet many of its most powerful companies come from British business as well, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company being an enormous player in the region. This would ultimately become the company British Petroleum today. British banking has an extremely prominent presence here. The Royal Iranian Bank was an extremely powerful institution for quite some time, and that eventually became HSBC Middle East. And as we know today, HSBC is an enormously powerful financial institution. Britain's history in the Middle East is much more militaristic than other regions. However, much of its oil infrastructure, which is perhaps the most important infrastructure in the history of modern Middle Eastern development, came from British companies. Beyond just oil and financial companies, major infrastructure projects were British-owned. The Suez Canal being a major example. When Benjamin Disraeli acquired the shares of the Suez Canal, it was financed by N.M. Rothschild & Sons, which is an enormous amount of debt to be the creditor for an infrastructure project that is a vital necessity to an empire's existence. After the East India Company dissolved, much of the most active trade in the British Empire moved to Asia, particularly the Chinese tea trade. And in Asia, there are certainly examples of direct British military conflict, particularly as in the 19th century, the British government was beginning to become much more directly involved in imperial oversight. Some of the most major players in this trade were Jardine Matheson & Co., Dent & Co., and John Swire & Sons. Jardine Matheson still exists as an enormous conglomerate today, with around $35 billion in annual revenue, and remains owned by the Keswick family. The Keswick family are related to the Jardine family and the Kadoorie family, who own substantial Hong Kong assets today, including the CLP Group and Hong Kong Shanghai Hotels. Hong Kong Shanghai Hotels, for that matter, acquired the assets of Dent & Co. John Swire & Sons as well exists today as Swire, and remains owned by the Swire family. Many of the assets in this area as well eventually would become HSBC itself. Across Southern Asia, not to even mention Australia, are all a few businesses held by a few families that have since become enormous conglomerates held by a few families. Its legacy has existed pretty undisturbed in some of these places, and with it, enormous power. However, the Chinese government has since tried quite hard to remove this British influence. Yet in Hong Kong and Singapore in particular, many of these institutions still operate, just in a new form. North America is most likely the one that we're most familiar with, and it has the most land that still exists directly as part of the British Empire, in the form of the British Commonwealth. Canada and Caribbean territories can be directly observed as Crown territories. However, the United States relationship with London, these imperial businesses and families, is a much more complex matter. In many ways, the British Empire is quite misunderstood, and in many ways it never ended. Though much of the empire was acquired directly by the crown in the 19th century, so much of what made the empire was not only built by private business and finance, both in London and Amsterdam, but always remained that way. What is HSBC if not the British Empire? At least a part of it. How about Rothschild and Sons, Swire, Unilever? What really was the British Empire? Well, perhaps it's best thought of as a commercial and financial network. And if it is a commercial and financial network, then really it never ended. It's the familial networks. It's the financial system in London. It's the network of offshore banks, the mines and the infrastructure, the conglomerates. It's the political system as much as it is a network of favors. And just because you won't find it on a map doesn't mean it's not there.